Welcome back. We're continuing with the four kinds of international crimes that are committed by Vladimir Putin, or for which he could be accused of having committed. And understand that these things are still ongoing, they're still happening. We talked about the crime of aggression, the starting the war, invading the Ukraine. And so that's already a done deal. So that's already a committed international crime. We talked about the next international crime is the big one, war crimes. Now this is the one you hear about all the time. I was listening to the news tonight, and there have been 30,000 claims of war crimes having been committed in the Ukraine conflict since February. 30,000, and there have already been some cases initiated for prosecution of war crimes by the Ukrainian government. War crimes is a very vast area of international criminal law and the law of armed conflict, because it's where most of the violations in armed conflict situations seem to happen. We're going to talk about war crimes now and define them, but then after that we're going to talk about crimes against humanity, because that's where you seldom hear about the term crimes against humanity in the context of the Ukraine conflict. So we're going to define both war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then we'll come for the fourth one, which is the crime of genocide. But for right now, we're going to go to the international crime known as war crimes. Now again, we use the term armed conflict instead of war, but war crimes is the term in common usage for violations of the law of armed conflict under certain in certain contexts, such as in the Geneva Convention context. So this is the definition of the international crime known as a war crime. International law defines war crimes as, quote, serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in international armed conflict, and serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in an armed conflict not of an international character. War crimes are international offenses committed under legal norms found in both international treaty law and under customary international law, which again is the consistent pattern of states over a course of time, with the opinio juris, the understanding that that practice has ripened or crystallized into an international customary norm. So a customary norm can apply as well as a treaty norm. For example, torture. Torture is both an international treaty norm found in the Torture Convention and found in the law of armed conflict in the Geneva Codes. And also it's a customary international law violation. So there are three sources of the norm for torture. The definition, okay, that's referring to the source of norms as including customary law. Treaty violations are mostly found under the title of grave breaches of the four Geneva Conventions, the Conventions on Protection of Victims on land, soldiers on the land, soldiers and sailors at sea, the third one being prisoners of war, and the fourth one being civilians in occupied territories. So those four Geneva Conventions, they contain in them a section called grave breaches, which tell you which of the norms in the convention are so grave that they constitute international crimes. So when you see grave breaches, that means it's going to describe an international crime. And we'll talk about what some of those specific crimes are under that broad title of war crimes. So war crimes includes a lot of little subcategories and predicate acts that we'll talk about in a moment. Most of these international norms for the protection of the armed conflict are four types, and again we said the four Geneva Conventions. Many of the violations of customary law, customary international humanitarian law norms, are found in the so-called Hague Rules, especially the Hague 4 rules from 1899 and 1907. So those are two sources, the treaties and the custom, where we find international crimes in those instruments. The first source that we're going to look at for war crimes is the definition in the Draft Code of Crimes Against the Peace and Security of Mankind. We referred to that previously. So, what does the Draft Code of Crimes Against the Peace and Security of Mankind have to say about what war crimes are described as? Here's the definition. Article 20 of the Draft Code reads as follows. Okay, this is going to be long and it's going to be boring, but try to follow me. I'll try to go slowly and articulate and hopefully read these in a way that you'll put mental pictures in your mind as I go through these different acts. How many different things are war crimes? Okay, any of the following war crimes constitute a crime against the peace and security of mankind, meaning it's an international crime, when it's committed in a systematic manner or on a large scale. So for the draft code, it's not just any violation that one soldier shoots a prisoner of war and that's a war crime in and of itself. This definition looks at it in a more broad sense in terms of there are the actions that are committed are systematic or on a large scale raises them to the international level of international concern. Now here are some of the acts. A, any of the following acts committed in violation of international humanitarian law. 1, willful killing. 2, torture or inhuman treatment, including biological experiments. 3, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health. 4, extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. 5, compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power. 6, willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protected person of the rights of fair and regular trial. You have a right to due process of law when you're being dealt with by someone under whose control you are found as a prisoner of war or another protected person. For example, a doctor or a pastor, a chaplain. You might be under the control of the opposite power, the enemy power. You have rights even then as you're under the control of the other party, and including the right to fair trial. The next one, 7, the unlawful deportation or transfer of unlawful confinement of protected persons. That's transfer or unlawful confinement of protected persons. So you deport them from their country to another country, or to your country, the enemy's country, or you transfer or unlawfully confine any protected persons, like a doctor, a chaplain, someone who's not a combatant. Number 8, taking of hostages. You can't capture people like civilians and make them hostages and tell them to go stand in a doorway so the opposing soldiers can't enter the building because the hostages will get killed. So it is prohibited to take hostages to try to protect an area from being attacked. B, any of the following, this is another set of categories of acts, any of the following acts committed willfully in violation of international humanitarian law and causing death or serious injury to body or health. And here are the following acts. Making the civilian population or individual civilians the object of attack. Now, this is one of the main things that we see in Ukraine. 2, launching an indiscriminate attack affecting the civilian population or civilian objects in the knowledge that such attack will cause excessive loss of life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects. 3, launching an attack against works or installations containing dangerous forces in the knowledge that such attack will cause excessive loss of life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects. Now, this would include the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. If Russia were attacking the power plant and jeopardizing the release of, risking the release of nuclear contamination. Also, the Russians recently bombed a dam and flooded a whole area, and I think some people were killed in that flooding. So these are called dangerous forces, and it's unlawful to unleash dangerous forces that can affect a lot of people and that has a result that's indiscriminate. It gets both combatants and non-combatants. Remember, the only thing you can attack is a military objective. Okay. 4, making a person the object of an attack in the knowledge that they're hors de combat. They're no longer capable of fighting, and you attack them anyway. Okay, the next one. 5, the perfidious use of distinctive emblem of the Red Cross. So if you put up a Red Cross on top of a missile silo so that it wouldn't be bombed, because it would appear to be something that is a medical facility and a protected facility, that would be a perfidious use of the distinctive emblem of the Red Cross. Perfidy means you're pretending to be something you're not. You're trying to fool someone, but what you're doing is unlawful. Now, there are tricks of war called ruses, R-U-S-E, ruses of war, like setting up a fake machine gun nest or a fake airplane on a runway to fool the enemy and get them to waste ammunition on shooting those. That would be a ruse of war. But a perfidy is you're using something that's legitimate as a cover for something that's harmful and wrong. That's perfidy. That is deemed to offend the sense of chivalry, which is another principle and characteristic that is expected of combatants, that they must be chivalrous and not stoop to really treacherous ways of acting, like raising the white flag saying, look, we're going to surrender, and really you come up to surrender and then you pull out your guns and you shoot the other guy who put his guns down because he thought you were surrendering. That's called perfidy. Any of the following acts committed willfully in violation of international humanitarian law: the transfer of the occupying power of parts of its own population into the territory it occupies. So if Russia were to bring Russians into the Ukrainian territory, that would violate this norm. I'm not saying that they have, but I wouldn't be surprised if they brought some Russians into those areas, transferring the civilian population, not the military, the civilians. Next, the unjustified delay in repatriation of prisoners of war. So at a certain point, when the armed conflict is over, each side will have to return the prisoners of war back to their own country. That's the way the law is. You return those prisoners of war at the end of the act of hostilities. So if you don't do that in a timely manner, that's a war crime. Outrages upon the personal dignity in violation of international humanitarian law, in particular, humiliating and degrading treatment, rape, enforced prostitution, and any form of indecent assault. So those sort of immoral acts constitute war crimes too. Next one, any of the following acts committed in violation of the laws or customs of war. 1. Employment of poisonous weapons or other weapons calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. So if, for example, you used a laser to blow out the eyeballs of a tank driver that's coming at you, that would be employment of a weapon calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. Or if you put poison tips on your bullets to cause excessive extra pain or do extra damage to the person. Again, you only use what force is necessary to neutralize the enemy objectives, the enemy objects, and personnel who are coming against you to neutralize you. Force must not be excessive, and it must not cause unnecessary suffering. One of our principles. Next, wanton destruction of cities, towns, or villages, or devastation not justified by military necessity. Now, if there's anything we've seen in the Ukraine conflict, that's it. Wanton destruction of cities, towns, or villages, or devastation not justified by military necessity. So in the Ukraine, it appears that Russia wanted to bomb the heck out of every place to get the Ukrainians to leave and get out of there so the Russians could go in and populate it and then exercise sovereignty, try to exercise sovereignty over the territory by having a vote of the remaining Russian-friendly people or Russians who were there and declaring that a part of Russia. So it appears that that's why they might have been doing that. But anyway, the wanton destruction of cities, which we see all over the Ukraine, is a war crime. Next, attack or bombardment by whatever means of undefended towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings, or of demilitarized zones. If you try to attack in a demilitarized zone, then that's a war crime. If you bombard any undefended towns, and normally towns will declare themselves as undefended, meaning there are no soldiers from that town, from the military of that country in the town, so there's no combatants to fight. So you don't attack the town because there's no military objective there. There are no troops, no weapons that can oppose you. Okay, next, seizure of, destruction of, or willful damage done to institutions dedicated to religion, charity, and education, the arts and sciences, historic monuments, and works of art and science. So, you are prohibited, as a matter of international law, to seize, destroy, or willfully damage institutions dedicated to religion, churches, mosques, synagogues, institutions dedicated to charity and education, a school, the arts and sciences, museums, historic monuments, and works of art and science. So this is happening all over the Ukraine, this kind of destruction of religious and educational facilities, because that's about the spirit of the people, and it's about the future of the country in terms of raising and educating the children, educational institutions. The next one is prohibited is plunder of public or private property. You cannot go into a place as soldiers and start taking things, stealing the food, stealing the money in the cash register, stealing the jewelry, taking out a computer. That's called plunder. And that is plunder of either public property, government property, or private property is prohibited. So you cannot plunder, even though you've been victorious over a town or an area. It doesn't give you the right to go in and take what you want. That's called plunder. Okay, the next one is in the case of armed conflict, using methods or means of warfare that are not justified by military necessity, with the intent to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment and thereby gravely prejudice the health or survival of the population and such damage does occur.